Hello and welcome back to the channel, and it's another book review. So continuing on from March, I believe it was, when I reviewed the first three books in this series, it is time to review the next trilogy of the Saga of Darren Shan, and that is the Vampire Mountain trilogy, containing of the books Vampire Mountain, which is book 4, Trials of Death, which is book 5, and the Vampire Prince as book 6. So, let us get started. So, in book 4, Vampire Mountain, this is where Darren and Mr. Crapsley travel to Vampire Mountain, where council is held every 12 years, where that's where a bunch of generals, regular vampires, and the princes all meet up in the mountain. No official business can happen for 3 days and 3 nights. It's all just one big massive party with some games as well, like such as boxing, fighting on bars and stuff like that. And because they're vampires and they're so strong, things can get bloody. So the likes of broken bones, broken arms, broken legs, getting knocked unconscious, shit like that, vampires thrive on in this series. And so they make the trek, but before they leave for Vampire Mountain, a one Mr. Tiny shows up and has two of his little people travel with Darren and Crepsley to deliver a message to the vampire princes. Now, the princes, they never really leave the Vampire Mountain because at least 3 princes have to be in attendance at any given stage, and one has to abstain, one has to stay out. And so we learn of their names. The main old vampire, his name is Skiles. He's been around for over 800 years. We also learn of Mika Verlent, as well as Arrow, who married a human and and left the fold for a while. But once Vampinese killed his wife, he rejoined the fold and became a prince. And the vampire who is absent is a Vansha March, who we will meet late in a different trilogy. So they make the trek. Along the way, they meet up with Gavner, and so they all go. But then they discover something suspicious. When they make it to a way station, these areas that vampires can rest for a night or two, there's some coffins there, some human blood. They notice that there's a vampire that has been killed. We don't see his corpse, but they do see the blood and a broken coffin, so they get very suspicious. And so they continue on. Along the way, they end up befriending some wolves who absolutely love vampires, and Darren has taken a keen eye to 2 of them, given them names. One of them called Strek, who was the alpha of this small little pack, and a little cub named Rudy, because Rudy loves to stick his warm wet nose on people. And so they continue. As they go through a path of thorns, the wolves are the ones who sense it first. Something's been here down this way before. The Vampinese have been down here, which is interesting because the Vampinese, after the war, couple of 100 years ago, aren't allowed to go down this way, and so they get very suspicious. And then, of course, they just before making it to they make it to a way station, and they go. Crapsley and Gavner go on searching for this Vampinese. And whilst they're doing that, Darren and Rudy are out playing, and that's when Darren gets attacked by a grizzly bear. A mad one at that. At first, Darren thinks it's rabies, but eventually he takes it down. One of the little people, unfortunately, dies. And then the other one, which Darren has nicknamed Lefty, which was mentioned in the last book, speaks for the first time. And the little people don't normally speak at all. Except this person's name isn't Lefty. His name is Harkat Moles. and he has a message. This is when we learn that he has a message for the vampire princes and them alone. But the others manage to get him to say it as long as they swear that they never heard him say it before getting to the princes. That message is that the time of the Vampanese Lord is at hand. Darren doesn't think much of it, but it shakes the other two to their core. And it turns out that the grizzly bear, well, that had ingested some Vampanese blood and went berserk because one of the Vampanese they found a burial that had been dug up for one of these Vampanese. So then who buried him? So they eventually make it to the mountain. They reconnect with some of the old friends, like Larnton. He reconnects with his old mentor, Sebenile, who is why Crapsley talks the way he does. He doesn't talk like he doesn't say doesn't, can't, or won't. He'll say do not, cannot, will not type of way, because that's the way Seba talks. And then he also gets introduced to some other vampires, including one Curtis Molt, who is soon to be invested into being a vampire prince. And so Darren goes to the game rooms just before, because the main reason they're going is so that Crepsley can present Darren to the vampire princes for their approval, because Darren was blooded at such a young age. We're about 8 years post Cirque du Freak, the first book here, and if they give their blessing that Darren can be in the fold, then Crepsley's honor will be saved. The same with Darren's, and they can go hunky dory. Darren also faces off with Eris Sales on the bars and loses pretty quickly, but still earns her respect in the handshake. And then they're finally called before the princes, and that's when Crepsley is like, I have no good reason for why I did what I did. Also, during this book, we learned that Crepsley was close to being a vampire prince at one point. It was either this book or last book, I can't remember which, that he could have been a vampire prince. He was about to be nominated. And so the only thing that they can come up with in order to restore his honor and his good standing and prove that Darren is worthy of being a vampire and that Crepsley didn't make a mistake by blooding him is the trials of initiation, which Darren accepts. These are tests normally meant for generals or would-be generals, and that's when, after the fact, that he learns that if he fails in these trials, he's going to die. And that is the end of Vampire Mountain. Now, when I initially read through the Saga of Darren Shan series, like I mentioned, I read them out of order. So all of the stuff that happened in this book, I almost fucking poked my eye out there. I knew because I read the next book, Trials of Death, before that one, and then I read books 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 before I read The Vampire Prince. So I knew what happened in this book because I read this book. And it was the same with the first 3 books in the series. I read the book 3, book 1, then book 2. So honestly, it's the beginning part of this trilogy. It's the beginning part of the whole overarching story of the Vampire Mountain trilogy. And I like it. It introduces us to some fan favorite vampires like Periscyle, who's only been in mention, Sebenile as well. Get to see more Gavner, which I'm always happy about. And yeah, we get to learn more of the vampire ways. We know more about Council, and so on and so forth. We also learned that Periscyle was actually blooded when he was 2 years old, and he's considered to be one of the longest living vampires at nearly 900 years, give or take a decade or two. So that's why I do like it. But it's these next 2 books, Trials of Death and The Vampire Prince that I love more than Vampire Mountain. So speaking of Trials of Death, let's get started with me, shall we? So, the Trials of Initiation, what are they? Well, they are 5 total trials, and the trial goer picks one at random and then instantly goes to do the trials. They could be anything. But that's when some leeway gets pulled for, in Darren's cases, an old tradition that isn't really used all that much, but is going to be availed of here, and that is Darren is going to be given 24 hours of preparation, followed by 24 hours of rest after the trial. So that basically adds up to 48 hours in between each trial. And then, of course, there still is the council, the Festival of the Undead, to also be a thing, because there's still just 3 stragglers left to go. So Darren takes Venise Blaze, who's another character, a fan favorite character that we get introduced to. He is the games master. He's the one who deals with all of this stuff and makes sure that everything is handled in a safe-ish, fair way that the vampires can, enjoy knocking each other senseless. So the first trial that gets pulled is the Aquatic Maze. And it's basically pretty simple. Darren is put into this maze, a water maze that slowly fills up. It takes about 15 minutes or so to fill up to the top, where he has to work his way out of the maze. But on top of that would be simple enough. He'd probably get it done before the water even touched the ceiling. But to make it that bit difficult, he has to look around a rock with half his weight. And so he does. He spends 24 hours making mental maps to be able to try to find his way out. Then when the trial starts, he's making his way, he's making his mental map. But from freeing the rock that gets snagged at one point, when he resurfaces, he forgets his mental map. And so he starts to panic. And so as he's going around, he finds a way to eventually start making the mental map. At this point, the water's still going up. Eventually, he has kind of given up that he's going to fail at this very first trial, and he's going to die in water. And one of the vampire beliefs is if you die in still water, your soul will be forever trapped and never reach paradise. But eventually, Darren does actually find the what he's looking for, which is a black X, and he finds it, he presses it, and he wins his first trial. Huzzah! So he gets ready for his next trial, but before that happens, 2 of the 3 people who are attending council show up and say that they found Vampinese trails on their paths to Vampire Mountain, which alarms them because obviously, as I mentioned in the last book, Harka told the princes of what happened, the time of the Vampinese Lord is at hand. So they're scared about that, like seeing that there's treks of Vampinese so close to their home, that that's the one thing that the Vampinese are not allowed to do. They can't break that tradition. So Darren picks his second trial, which is the Path of Needles. Normally for every trial, a vampire prince must be present, but because of the whole situation with the Vampinese, that can't happen. So Darren makes it through the Path of Needles. It's literally crawling over a bunch of stalactites with stalagmites on top. I think I have that right. I was okay at geography, but when it comes to the difference between stalactites and stalagmites, I can't remember for shit. But he eventually clears it, and just before he goes to do his third trial, that's when we learn that the third and final vampire attending council has arrived, which gives Darren 3 nights and 3 days of rest before his next and third trial. And so the Festival of the Undead gets underhand. There's a bunch of fighting, and tests of combat. There's a howl going on where whoever can howl the longest be dubbed sub blank of the howl for a year, and for 12 years until the next council comes around. And then, so a bunch of other stuff happens, and then of course it ends, and then Darren is brought back for his next trial, which is the trial at which he's basically going into this big. How I pictured it is this big metal room where fire is fed through. Because I can't remember the exact correct one terminology. Okay, it's called the Hall of Flames. I literally had to quickly go back. It starts at chapter 11. So yeah, basically Darren has trains with Era to listen to where the fire is going to come from the pipes below, and it's very bad for Darren. He's basically now permanently bald because of the burns he received. He was burned all over his body because at certain points through that trial he had to leap through walls of fire just to make it so that he wasn't scorched alive. And then his feet are also badly burned. Thankfully, they are savable. He hasn't burned the nerves off of it. But when the trial is ended, Darren is in a delirious state, thinking that there's going to be a grand finale to this, that there's going to be a big waft of fire coming out, and he's trying to listen. And even when others start to come in, he's telling them to go away, go away. He's trying to. His vocal cords are a bit damaged because of the soot and the smoke that he inhaled during this trial. So the medics do what they can to save him. And Darren, unfortunately, after his little bit of a rest period, has to report to the vampire princes to pick the next trial. And he does, and it's the trial of the blooded boars, where he basically has to fight two boars that have been injected with vampire blood and driven mad. However, as a kind of way to give Darren an extra rest period after what he endured in the Hall of Flames, the three princes say that they cannot be there to oversee it for the next 3 days. That's their kind of loop around, because they are very stickler with tradition. Had Darren not showed up and showed that he was willing to go to the next trial, he would have been carted off to the Hall of Death and executed. So he gets his 3 days and 3 nights of rest. He makes it to the Battle of the Blooded Boars, and unfortunately, he does not win. He takes out one of the boars, it collapses on top of him. Had he an extra day or two of rest, he would have been probably more fair to take out both boars. But because one was on top of him, he didn't have any way to. But we don't really fully know. He might have been able to summon off enough strength to avoid the boar and eventually kill it, and then moving on to the final trial. We don't know, but because just before the boar even makes it to Darren, Harket jumps in and saves him, kills the boar and saves him. That sends all the vampires into a frenzy because they see that Darren has failed the trial and should be carted off to the Hall of Death. But these are unprecedented times because Harket is a little person, a minion of Desmond Tiny. He's not subjected to their laws. And so they go into the chambers, the generals do, to discuss this. To discuss whether or not to give Darren a retrial, or if to say that he's failed and to be carted off to the Hall of Death. Whilst that's happening, Curta comes and basically convinces Darren that it's time to go. We're going to. I know he knows some back tunnels because he is a map maker, and he is going to let Darren escape. Wait for him to be invested to be a vampire prince, and then he can soften the other princes around and the other vampires around to omitting this this failure of Darren. And so he does. And whilst they're going, Gavner catches up with them, and Gavner rather reluctantly agrees to accompany Curta and Darren. But when they get down, they see that Kurt is a bit fidgety. And when they get into an area that is familiar to Gavner because of his own trials of initiation, they go somewhere, and that's when they find them, the Vampanese, which scares them to death. There's about 30 to 40 Vampanese there in the Vampire Mountain. Should not be there. They think that they're going to attack whilst they were at council. So they try to double back, they can't, and so Gavner they get spotted. So Gavner is taken on a few of them, whilst given enough time for Kurta and Darren to escape. They're supposed to escape up to the halls to alert everyone of what was happening. Kurta goes back to help Gavner, sending Darren on the way. But then something in Darren stops, and he goes to stand and help them, even though he shouldn't have. And when he did that, that's when he witnesses Gavner's death at the hands of Kurta Smolt. Turns out, Kurta is in league with the Vampanese. Now, this is something that we did know, that he was gaining the trust of certain Vampanese, getting to know their blood cousins, to maybe, hopefully, one day reunite the two clans, which is why he also has the 3 scrapes on his cheek, which is something that the Vampanese do to mark their meals. So Darren sees this. Kurta tries to get him to stop. He legs it, trying to get up to the halls, but they reach the hall of final voyage, and just before he tries to jump the stream because he's on the opposite side of where he needs to be to run into the halls. He jumps and he falls in, and as Kurta is trying to save him, he basically says nuts to that and goes down the Hall of Final Voyage, which is something no vampire has ever done, because that was only there for those old fogies who like to, the way they used to bury the vampires instead of the cremation that they do now. And that is the end of the book. I love this book. Out of the trilogy, I say, unfortunately, it is my second favorite. And that's just because I do, after rereading The Vampire Prince, I do enjoy that one a bit more. But I definitely do enjoy Trials of Death. I love, leading into the trials, having the trials of initiation happen, seeing Darren succeed until the very end. And then, of course, the surprise of Gavner's death, which, honestly, the first time reading Trials of Death shocked me to my core. Because, as I said, Tunnels of Blood was my first book that in the series that I read. And the little bit that we had of Gavner, I loved and enjoyed. And seeing him in this book, prior to, again, reading Vampire Mountain, I enjoyed that because he was becoming one of my favorite characters. There's a reason he's a fan favorite character. And then having Kurta Smolt just kill him in order to fund his own goals broke me. It did, because I as I said, Gavner's one of my favorites. And so for the longest time, I knew Darren survived because I read the last 2 trilogies, the Hunters trilogy and the Sons of Destiny trilogy, or the Lord of Shadows trilogy. But I never got around to reading Vampire Prince. But that is the review done for Trials of Death, and we now move on to The Vampire Prince, which I literally sped read in about a day. Like last night, as I'm recording this on the 2nd of April. Last night I read about 70 odd pages from chapter 4 to which was page 18 to 90, which was chapter 15, I think. And then today I finished the book before coming home from my course. So yeah, let's get started with this book. So this book breaks down into 3 acts. Act 1 is the survival of Darren. Act 2 is bringing Kurta to justice, as well as the fight for the Vampanese, and then part 3 is the trial of Kurta. So Act 1, we do see that Darren does survive. The first 2 or 3 chapters are discussing his descent down the Hall of Final Voyage, into the ravine. He manages to, rather surprisingly, survive it, but he's too badly banjaxed. So again, as I mentioned about vampires dying in still water, that's what gets him to crawl out of the water. His clothes, the clothes that he's wearing, are drenched and heavy, so he needs to shed those clothes fast. Otherwise, he will die of hypothermia and in this cold, because Vampire Mountain's in a snowy area, and so he does, using his teeth. He tries to make for the trees, to the forest, but doesn't. And so he's accepting death at this point. The luck of the vampires has ran through with him. But then somebody comes, and it's not any vampire, it's Rudy from the fourth book. Yeah, he comes. Council has just ended. So, of course, the wolf pack are done with their council and going to move on back to their old hunting grounds. And Rudy and Streak comes up, warms them up, gets them to warm them up enough to bring him back to the pack. And the pack basically accept him because of his vampire blood, makes him one of their own, nurses him back to health, and that's the way it is. And so when Streak and Rudy go hunting on their own, Streak basically in his own way tells Darren to hide, and he does. And that's when he spots Mr. Crepsley in a search party with Era, two others, and Kurda. Now, Kurda and the two others have swords with them. So Darren suspects that those two are in league with Kurda, and that the moment Darren shows up, they'll take out Darren, Crepsley, and Era, so that way news of his treachery won't happen. Unfortunately, that does not happen. They eventually go back, and Darren learns that in 2 days he will be made a vampire prince. So he knows he has to go back to the Vampire Mountain. And so he says that to Streak, and Streak goes over to this old she-wolf who's on death's door and gets her to bring Darren up a way to basically go into the Hall of Princes without even needing to the door, because they use the Stone of Blood to open the door and stuff like that, and only princes can do that. And so Darren hatches a plan. He goes to see the old quartermaster of Seba. He explains it all to him. They hatch a plan, and then just before Kurda is made a prince, he springs out, explains it. It nearly goes awry, but he explains it, and Kurda does not deny it. So then they go searching for the Vampanese. They eventually find them, and they're trying to come up with a plan to fight them, where Venise thinks that even if they fight and kill these 30 to 40 Vampanese, that they'll also incur a death of 30 to 40. And so then Darren comes up with an idea whilst holding Madame Octa. So he goes to find the Bahelen spiders, which are spiders that are native to the mountain. They come up with, and so they're going to use them because one bite won't be poisonous. Several, just be a little irritation, but several bites, that's a problem. More of a nuisance. And so that's what they plan. They're going to strike during the day, send all the spiders in, create a bit of diversion, and that's when the vampires are going to spring through the caves and fight them to the death. And that's basically what happens. In a matter of probably 10-20 minutes, they wipe out the Vampanese, capture a few. Darren kills 2, and the moment he kills this first person, because he was, like a lot of the vampires, he was giddy. He was excited for the battle, which is common with the vampires. Their blood boils for a good fight. Similar to the way the Klingons are in Star Trek, which isn't actually intentional. That's the way Darren wrote these vampires, were to be similar to the Klingons of Star Trek. And so, but once he gets his first kill, he realizes how pointless it is. Whilst yes, it had to be done. Yes, it needed to be done. The Vampanese had to be killed. But why didn't they just, try to figure out why they were here? the whole trial of Kurta doesn't happen until after the fact, until after the burial of certain of the vampires that fell. In total, about 12 vampires fell, unfortunately, including Era Sales, which when I read these out of order, I knew of her death because from reading Hunters of the Dusk. Because I think when I first read these books, I went from Trials of Death to the Hunter book. So I knew of Era's death before reading Vampire Mountain. Like I said, not Vampire Mountain, the Vampire Prince, which I believe was the last book that I needed to read in the series. So I knew of that going into it, but when I was rereading it today, I'm not gonna lie, I got choked up. I got really emotional about it. Reading that happening, reading Crepsley's, how it affected Crepsley before she even died, and then after the fact, and it got to me. And yeah, it's like with Gavner's death in Vampire Mountain. This one definitely affected me. Because again, not much was seen in her. She's only been in these 3 books until I get to the Saga of Larden Crepsley. But I enjoyed her character. And I love the little bits of the relationship that we do see of herself and Crepsley in the Saga of Larden Crepsley. But yeah, the Vampires are taken care of, so it's time to find out why Kurta has done this. And in his sick, twisted mind, it was for the betterment of the clan. Because he got word of the Vampires Lord far quicker than they did. So he knew going when the hand of the Vampires Lord was at hand, he knew that he'd already been found. But hadn't been blooded yet. So the Vampires, around the same time that the vampires were told of the rise of the Vampires Lord, several hundred years ago, the Vampires were given this coffin, and if anyone who went into it, and the lid was placed on it, the coffin would engulf in flames. And only the true Vampires Lord would come out unscathed. And 6 months ago, 6 months prior to all of the events of these 3 books, that happened. They have their Vampires Lord. He hasn't been blooded yet. So he had convinced 40 Vampires to make the trek during this council, after he was invested into being a priest, he was going to have poisoned the 3 other princes and guided them, the Vampires, up and locked themselves in the Hall of the Princes with the access to the Stone of Blood, would have made them have access to it, and that should have, reunited the 2 clans. And, Kurta was going to die regardless of what happened. But obviously, Darren foiled that plan, and for that, he was strung up in the Hall of Death and killed, as well as his co-conspirators. And so then we come back to dealing with what's going to happen to Darren. He's failed his trials, and on top of that, he ran away. But with the courage and the putting the clan forward, they can't overlook that. They can't change the rules, So what can they do? Well, it was Arrow who suggested that there's only 4 people who are above such laws that can take the trial over and over again and fail. That is the Vampire Princes. So, in order to not have Darren called away to the Hall of Death for, failing the trials and running away, they make him a prince. So Darren is the youngest vampire prince ever. He's still a half vampire. They didn't make him a full vampire, but that is the end of that. And I love this book. Like I said, out of these 3, Vampire Mountain is my favorite. Out of the Vampire Mountain trilogy, Vampire Prince, not Vampire Mountain. I'm going to keep doing that probably. I love the fact that we learn why Kurt had done what he had to do, what he thought was right. The failures of that, the death of Era, unfortunately, but also the cremation of Gavner. that, you know, they went and found his body, and Darren being made a prince. So yeah, that is why that is my favorite, and it's a big journey for Darren to go through. You know, he has his first taste of blood from killing two Vampanese. You know, he kills one a young Vampanese who's trying to run out. He kills the person who kills Era, a Vampanese with a birthmark on him, and he hates it. He hates that the vampires are having such joy from it and stuff. And it is honestly a great character journey that Darren has gone through. You know, from being presented to the princes, to going through the trials of initiation, to thwarting Kurta's plans. I loved every single moment of that. And that is where this review is going to end. I don't know when I'll be picking this back, the trilogy back up again for the next trilogy, because I have the next book right here, which is Hunters of the Dusk, which is, of course, starting the Hunters trilogy, which is Hunters of the Dusk, Allies of the Night, and Killers of the Dawn. I'm not looking forward to rereading Killers of the Dawn. For those who've already read through this franchise, already know exactly why I am rather reluctant to reread that book. But I have to go through it every time I reread this series, which is unfortunate. But anyway, that is going to wrap this up. I have no idea what's coming next, because I haven't planned anything for what's coming next. But thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all on the very next upload.